Afternoon, everyone, depending on where you guys are located. Welcome to the Chicago Systems Management User Group meeting for Q4. My name is Jay Perek, one of the founders of the user group out of Chicagoland area. We do meet in person a few times a year, but given the end of year and schedules, we wanted to present this online. So makes it more available for folks, not just in Chicago, but other locations as well. Today's session for the first hour, we'll have Mike Terrell and Gary Block, both of strong Microsoft management um, guides, an MVP from Microsoft. They've been in the community for a very long time, especially on the SCCM community, and present at many user groups around the country, as well as the Midwest Management Summit that happens every year. They're going to present today at the first hour, and then in the second hour, starting at noon, we'll have Steve Rashi from Microsoft. He's a premier field engineer focused on systems management as well. So with that, I'll turn this over to Mike and Gary to go through their presentation. And if there's questions, just put it in the Q&A. And then if we end early on top of the hour, we'll open the mics up for questions as well. So Mike and Gary.
Thanks. All right. So thank you very much. As you said, Mike and I work for Big Bank. We are currently the main guys for the WAS implementation, the Windows as a Service, and we've gone through a couple iterations so far, and we're just hoping to share with you guys what we've been working on. So Mike came up with this. I'll let him explain our little logo there, the maximize velocity, minimize risk, and what that means.
Yep. So thanks for joining today. That's kind of been our tagline for what we call Windows as a Service in the enterprise. We needed to do something. We realized that things were changing with how we do Windows 10 upgrades and things like that. And being that we do work in a very risk-averse environment, we needed to do something to where we could not only minimize that risk, but also maximize the velocity because we manage, close to 400,000 devices, so globally. So we came up with this concept, and we wanted to make it so that it was actually reusable and whatnot. So do you want to page forward, Gary? So that's kind of what we're going to focus on as our solution. This is, like Gary said, this is the second jump we've done. We do have a relatively complex environment, but it doesn't mean that you can't take bits and pieces or even the entire solution and apply it to your environment. We're not going to cover servicing much because the PFEs all have that pretty much covered, and it's supposed to be really easy. But we also came up with a new concept this year, which is reducing that risk even further. And we'll talk about the ability to revert back to the previous version of Windows 10 in case of issues come up and whatnot. So but we're going to touch on each of these, and hopefully we have enough time to get through them all. We got tons of content here, and also we do have a lot of this blogged. Either on my blog or Gary's blog, and I think he'll pop that up at the end as well. And then feel free to use the Q&A. We'll try to reply to questions that come in here. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but this is really our WAS process flow. It's kind of a multi-phased approach, and it's pretty well documented on our blogs, but we wanted to be able to kind of catch as many kind of issues before the upgrade actually even kicks off on an end user's machine, especially if it's an upgrade that they're aware of. So we have controlled releases that just pretty much go at night and nobody's really aware of those. But then we have other releases that can actually be invoked by the end user themselves. And what we didn't want is they kick it off and then all of a sudden there's a hard block on the machine that prevents the upgrade from going, or it takes hours and hours to run because it's still downloading the OS upgrade media or something like that. So we wanted to be able to go through several iterations of, getting this device ready and making sure that it's ready, so that when they hit the go button, we're 99% sure that it's going to be successful. So we wanted to be able to action on some of those things like remediation, for any kind of pre-assessment. And we'll talk about pre-assessment here in a little bit. You might have heard of blockers. So I think Microsoft just announced that they lifted the block for, it was one of the Bluetooth modules for 1903. So this is the public blocking. So if you had a device that you weren't seeing 1903 on, yeah, they put their own blocks in place because they know, oh shoot, this is causing an issue, and we're gonna block this device from even seeing 1903. So our pre-assessment is kind of like our own internal blocks, basically. If you don't meet certain criteria, then you don't go forward in the process until you're remediated. Once they get through pre-cache, compat scan, all that, they go into ready for scheduling, and we have a very kind of different complex scheduling options. They can schedule for a particular day. We also have something new that we introduced this go around. Well, actually, we had it limited for kind of tech-led upgrades last year, what we called on-demand, and we rebranded that to self-service this year. And then we have another scheduling option, which is what we call next available maintenance window. So for devices that already have specific maintenance windows, they just drop it in there, and whatever the next available maintenance window it happens to go. So we do some pre-flight checks, which are now directly coupled to our pre-assessment checks as well, just to see if there was any drift between the time I did pre-assessment and that. But so this is the process. It worked well for our 1607 to 1709. Did that on about 150 to 160,000 machines, and then we're now jumping from 1709 to 1809 on probably about 375,000 machines. The others will be reimages or refreshes and that kind of thing. So one of our big changes, and we kind of treat this as like a software platform or a software product itself, is our pre-assessment. So previously, we kind of did this in a standalone kind of database and whatnot. And I'm actually jumping ahead because this is a report of all of our collections. So we have a nice report here. That shows all the different devices and what phases they're actually in the process. So as you can see, this may or may not be real data. I can't really speak to that, but you get a good sense of how many devices we have in different phases, whether they're in the self-service or AK on-demand. We have exclusions in place. Those are kind of our safety belts. So if we need to exclude certain machines from ever even going into the process, we have that ability there. We have some things that drop out towards the tail end, which we call needs remediation, where the upgrade may or may not have run. It could have been due to pre-flight failures, like always being on battery or things like that are mainly what we see. We have seen some other task sequence related issues as well. So next slide, Jack. So this is our pre-assessment overview. So this is really where our filtering really starts to begin, and we've consolidated all these rules. And I don't know, Gary, if you remember how many we're up to now, but pre-assessment, the whole intent of that is we only want the device to go through if there's not a hard block. So if the Windows 10 setup is going to get stuck at a hard block, we create a pre-assessment rule for that. And B, if we know that there's going to be an issue, there's other things like with the system, for example, like disk space or OS build or things like that. But then we also use it for applications that are not quite ready. So they might have a down level application. It either it doesn't might prevent the in-place upgrade from working correctly, or B, the application itself doesn't work after the in-place upgrade, and that's kind of been our Achilles heel. But the main thing is we re-engineered this for WAS 1809 to where these are all CI based now. So everything, we're just leveraging the CI engine, settings management engine, and configuration manager, and we can do some really cool stuff in terms of being very specific on the versions that we allow versus the versions we don't allow. We introduced hardware models. We're actually now blocking hardware models in our environment that the vendors don't support on 1809, for example, or ones that we're trying to remove from our environment to be not mentioned. But so that's kind of how we're doing our pre-assessment, and I think Gary will actually get into kind of the nuts and bolts behind this.
Yeah, one other thing I'd like to mention is we have like a rule for the config manager client. Early in the process, we had built our task sequence around a specific version, our features included in one of the current branch releases of config manager, and we were having errors on certain machines as they tried to run the task sequence, and then we found that they had like a 1806 client still because of whatever reason. So we built that into our pre-assessment checks where it requires it to have a specific version of the client, and if it doesn't, then it gets dropped into the like auto remediation collection to make sure that that client gets upgraded, so that when it runs a task sequence, it has all the features required. Each version of config manager, they are pretty good about adding some new features for task sequences that are actually pretty helpful for in-place upgrades. So we have to make sure then that the clients are all at that specific level. We, for all the CIs that we have, we also have a report that explains to our other support staff what we're actually looking for. We'd often get questions, well, what version are you allowing through the process in a machine has? I ask this question quite a bit. So finally, I just wrote a report that queries config manager and pulls that information, so then I can just point them at, go to this report, you'll see the rules that we have in play and what we're actually looking for. So as Mike was saying, like we have 29 rules currently, probably even more since I took these screen captures. But it requires the machine to be compliant on all of these different CIs before it will even consider moving ahead in the process. So what do the CIs look like? For applications, we have the application type. We have a detection method, so it goes out and looks for if this software is installed on this to make sure that it's applicable. If the software is not installed, we don't care. We consider that a pass. But if it is installed, it's required to be one of the following versions. And so we've been asked numerous times, why do we choose one of instead of greater than? And for us, that was purely a control thing. We have a very controlled environment. If we were to say greater than, then those new versions might not have been regression tested throughout the process and might be introducing new variables that would be causing issues down the line. So before we allow or add a new version here, they have to, the application owners have to have gone through a couple in-place upgrades with that new version and prove that it's certified, internally certified for the in-place upgrade. And then we'd come back through that version, and that way moving forward, those machines will no longer be blocked. We were getting that question like, oh, we have a newer version installed, why are we getting blocked from the upgrade? Well, it's because you don't have one of the versions that we specifically allow. Another report, we used to get asked a lot of questions, and we still do. So we've tried to create a report for pretty much any question that they could ask. One of them was like, well, which machines have this issue? How do we determine that? A lot of people don't have access into Config Manager, which is great. So they still need to be able to surface that same information. So reporting is key to our success here. So we've created reports where they can say, well, for this specific rule, what machines are being blocked. So they can go in and see, oh, for this rule, there's 57 machines that are not compliant. So they can go and remediate these.
Okay, so OS uninstall. You may be familiar with two terms. Probably OS uninstall doesn't really come to mind, but rollback. And I actually got corrected by one of the Microsoft engineers that they're not the same thing, and we try not to use them in the same context. So a rollback is what would happen in the case of an in-place upgrade that kind of fails or stops in the middle, and it decides to roll back to the previous version. An OS uninstall, or oftentimes what we call a revert back, is you've upgraded to whatever version successfully, and you want to go back to the previous version for some reason or another. Now this has been in Windows 10 like since the very beginning. I remember doing a upgrade on an insider build probably before it was released at one of my user group meetings, and I didn't bring my AC adapter to the device I was using, and of course the power died like halfway through, and I thought for sure it was toast and plugged it in, and it rolled back, and it was bulletproof. So I commend the Windows team for putting this together. And even though the names are different based on the timing of when you do it, they're kind of built off of the same mechanisms and the same engine. So that kind of sold me of how bulletproof this process was. There wasn't any way to actually do this programmatically prior to 1803, so you couldn't actually invoke this via commands. Which meant that when we were doing our 1709 upgrade, we had no way of automating this. However, in 1803, they introduced some commands in DISM that actually did make this possible. So the main reason why we really engineered the heck out of this and promoted it, because Gary found that the client is pretty broken. It's kind of in a state of disarray when it goes back to the previous OS, because it still thinks it's in the middle of a task sequence and client's in provisioning mode. And Microsoft's addressed a couple of our bugs that we've reported. However, we want them to make this kind of an enterprise solution, because really the biggest struggle that we've had going to 1709 and also going to 1809 is applications that just are not properly written. They don't work after an upgrade. They're broken. And we have to put in what we call band-aids into our post-upgrade module, TS module that we have to fix these. And the last thing we want to do is take somebody working to not working after an upgrade, because we wanted to upgrade the OS. So go ahead and forward the next slide. So basically, this is what they would see, and we've only make this available to our self-service scheduling option, because if it still has a required deployment policy, it makes it a little bit tricky. If you've done this through the native Windows, you probably see a dialog box that looks like this. Just because I'm not very clever, I copied what Microsoft already had, and we enhanced it. So we got a nice drop-down list of applications if it's a particular app issue. That way we keep people from fat fingering it. If it's a device issue, maybe a card scanner or a PS2 mouse, I guess, they can put that in. If they're getting like blue screen issues or things like that, they can tick that off, or if there's something else. And then we have the option to be able to contact them or not if they opt into that. So this looks very similar to like what the Microsoft thing does, except we actually collect this information so that we can report on it and act on it and things like that. And literally in 3 to 5 minutes, they will be back to the previous version, and the versions are dynamically stamped in the log on screen there to let them know that they've gone back successfully. So um, this has helped out in the cases that we ran it. We didn't run it on a huge amount of machines this go around. Our scheduling team, it was very new to them, and they didn't really trust it. But on the ones that did, it worked successfully. There's a lot of behind the scenes stuff, and there's I think Gary's got a lot of the blogs on the undercovers, that things that we have to do to repair the client and whatnot. So have a look at that, and hopefully we'll see Microsoft start to come out with more native tools in this area, because it could really help us go forward and minimize that risk even further.
And throughout the process, we did discover some bugs, and Microsoft has dealt with those. So hopefully, moving forward, if a user does revert back, a lot of the pain points that we had to engineer around just won't be there anymore. It should self-resolve a lot more of the issues.
So next up is we'll just give a quick shout out to OSD Builder. For those of you that don't know what OSD Builder is, do a search on it. Dave Segura, he's the mastermind behind this, and this is what Microsoft should have come out with. But it basically gives you a way to create service media, so you can surface it with the latest servicing stack update, cumulative update, .NET updates, and it's not a build and capture, so you can use the output of this for in-place upgrades. We service our media monthly. That way, that when we upgrade a machine, it's updated to the latest. It doesn't have to come and get like a half gig CU that takes and adds another 60 to 90 or more minutes on top of the upgrade process. So we service our media. Typically, we push it to production the third Tuesday of the month if there's no patch issues, things like that kind of mirror our internal patching schedule. But go have a look at it, do a search on it, use it. You can also use the output, the install WIM, to do bare metal builds as well. So you got some huge efficiencies there. But definitely look at this tool. It's worth checking out. Driver management. So in terms of drivers, that tends to be talked about quite a bit lately, and it's important to use drivers. We found doing in-place upgrades on certain machines where if we didn't specify any drivers, we would see some driver bangs. And this is something that servicing actually kind of struggles with, because it doesn't really, you can't really specify the drivers, and drivers in Windows Update just are not where they need to be at, that kind of thing. So we do support, I think it's close to 50 models that we do driver management for. We have driver packs that we use just standard packages in CM that we can actually reuse for bare metal, and also to level set an existing machine that's already deployed in the field. And we reuse those standard packages because we don't introduce new models in our environment that often. I think we typically buy them with a 18-month buy, or maybe longer than that. And so we don't really introduce new models all that often, but we want to. The main reason for keeping the same packages is we want to be able to optimize our peer-to-peer efficiency, being that we have such a big network. And so if we're constantly changing driver packages across the same model, we would lose that efficiency, because we might just get to a point where we replace an audio driver because of a CVE or something like that. And that audio driver contents just gets replaced. Old one gets pulled out, new one gets put in, and then we're just getting deltas at that particular point. But Stay tuned because I think MMS 2020 will probably cover this in big detail on how we're doing driver management going forward.
Once again, we were always asked questions about which driver packs we're using and any information about it, which models we're supporting. So I created a report that would tell them all that information they wanted to know, as well as it creates a link to the KB out on the vendor site. So all this information that you see here is actually populated into the package itself using pretty much any field available in the package. It's all automated. There's a script that will go out to the vendor site, grab everything, dump it into the source, update the package information with the vendor information. And then we also have something that comes through and updates the package driver sets based upon like CVEs and security issues. So they'll remove a driver or update a driver, and they'll put those into the notes. And then that's also sucked into the description, so we know exactly what's changed from the base driver pack that we pulled down from the vendor. And this allows us to be completely just transparent to all the different engineering groups in our organization. The process for automatically pulling down from vendors and creating these, I blogged about a few months ago, so it's out on my blog too.
Yeah, and just another point to note that you might have seen in that previous screenshot is actually we're going to change the name on one because we don't want to confuse our deployment team. We started off using what we call pilot and production, but we actually refer to that now as kind of pre-production and production. So we basically pretty much duplicate everything we do. And Gary will tell you that you know I'm extremely gun shy, probably from my years of consulting, of actually touching anything production. Once it's production, it's pretty much gold, and it's got to be vetted, certified, and everything else. So we treat that, whether it's a task sequence module, whether it's content, whether it's you name it, a package that's in the process. We like to verify all that in what we call our pre-prod stuff, so that it's signed off on and certified before we actually push it to production. So it just gives us it gives us a good opportunity to evaluate any drivers, new driver packs or drivers that have changed, and they can get fully vetted before they actually get pushed to production, so that there's no further issues there. And it's actually saved us a couple of times already. So we'll find an issue. I think there was a erroneous folder in a driver package, for example, that was causing some drivers to crash and not work properly. So that's what we have, which is good. And here you can see, Gary's got an example up here. And we like to leverage all the properties in these fields because that's exactly what gets scraped in the reports that come out. And we're kind of lazy. Actually, we're not lazy. We're just really super busy. So we like to enable others to be able to go view this information, and hence the extensive web reports. And also we have an internal Confluence page that we write to, and we're constantly referring people to that on how it actually works. So cache management, pre-caching, and peer-to-peer. So cache management is huge. I think we pretty much set the standard in terms of doing any kind of in-place upgrades where you pre-cache all of the content ahead of time. That's just big. I mean, the content's already got to get down there. Why make the end user wait for it? And we figured that we could kill two birds with one stone and run a compat scan. So there might be a blocker in our environment that we don't know about yet, and that's how we get that information back. So by combining our pre-caching and the compat scan, we're able to get more information back about the applications in the environment. You know, like early on in the process is usually when we find the most issues. That's not true. We still see a lot of apps that break later in the process too. Um, but by pre-caching, you're kind of you're basically working uh, ahead of the game, and you're getting that content out there. We use peer-to-peer in our environment, so if you have a distributed environment, definitely look into using peer-to-peer technology. I've kind of shown some examples at like the last MMS on how branch cache can really pay dividends when it comes to data deduplication and getting some of that massive content down and only getting the block level differences across the WAN when there's updates and things like that. So if you do struggle with network links and slow network links, definitely look into some of that stuff as well.
As with most parts of our process, we create a report then to monitor the content flow throughout the environment. Basically, we have a CI for each piece of content. So for each driver pack, for the upgrade media itself, and the script packages, there's a CI that is that corresponds to it. And then the CI checks to see if it's in the CCM cache. And we also use Nomad, so we check to see if it's in the Nomad cache, and we can also confirm like what percent download it is for Nomad. So we have different logic for the if it's compliant or not. And if it's non-compliant, it shows up in this report, and then we can check to see why is this machine not have the content. Um, and we've also working on we have ways to auto remediate this as well, to have the CI trigger the download to actually pull the content in if it's not compliant. Troubleshooting, because unexpected things happen, and a lot of times unexpected things happen because of users. But even besides the users, other issues happen. Um, so the Windows in-place upgrade is pretty complex all in itself. So if you were just to go and click, setup.exe and walk through it, uh, this is the documentation. Microsoft has done pretty well at providing how the process works. So if you've triggered it, you've noticed like your task sequence, all of a sudden you're running and it says it starts the setup process and then it reboots. And then there's your setup, your SMSTS logs kind of empty for a while the setup engine is running in the different phases. And then your task sequence comes back to life towards the end of the setup engine. So it's very useful to understand when the task sequence cuts in and out for your troubleshooting abilities to know if and where the issue happens. Was it in the task sequence part? Was it in the setup engine? If it's in the setup engine, then you need to go and look at different logs. And it can be very telling of when it's going on. So I created this for some of our support staff to understand when they're looking at a machine, where to go and look at the logs, if it happened during this phase, and all the information, like if there was a rollback or an error. Uh, Windows is pretty good about storing some of that in the registry keys, so you can actually gather that for reports. And setup diag will help you with that as well. And the different places, I need to update this. In 1803, they also added a couple more different batch files that you can call during the process that will trigger at different times throughout the setup process. So even though you can't do anything at those times with the task sequence because the setup engine is already running, the setup engine will actually trigger these batch files, which if you're using servicing is kind of the only way you have to manipulate the setup during the process. Um, there are several different things in the task sequence that you can use to manipulate how the setup engine runs. And that would be the task sequence variable OSD setup additional upgrade options. And at that point, you can then specify what additional items you would like to run. We typically have the diagnostic prompt disabled, and we set the priority to high so that it will use as many CPU cycles as it can to just chug through, get the upgrade done. If you have third-party encryption, you would need to also specify that inside of this command. And then in the SMSTS log, you'll actually see the full setup command line. So you can verify that your settings are there, as well as like the driver package. That all shows up in there as well.
Go back to that previous slide there, Gary. So you'll probably also notice a post rollback command, which is setup rollback.cmd. We're actually looking to leverage that for our OS uninstall. And then we found out it was actually didn't do what it said it should do on the side of the 10. So we logged a case with Microsoft and filed a bug. It was a confirmed bug. And it's supposed to be fixed in which version is supposed to be fixed in, Gary? I can't. Oh, it's
They actually fixed it in 1809 with the latest dynamic updates, which is another reason that you're going to want to make sure you slipstream in your dynamic updates or check that box. And but you do have to make a change in your task sequence variable to leverage that, because by default it's going to run it in the user context, which is not useful at all. So you'd have to specify running it in the system context, which will be the default the next time config manager releases a new current branch.
And another point, see, you might see dynamic update disabled on the command line switches. So we don't leverage that here. That's why we use OSD Builder, because it'll grab the latest dynamic updates for us and include them in the media. If you do tick that box, be prepared to pull about anywhere up to a gig worth of content per device. So that's very dangerous in low bandwidth type environments. So just be careful of that. But that's where OSD Builder actually saves us. So. All right, enhancements coming to Config Manager. So CM team is working on the next current branch release, which I believe they'll stick with their XX10 release naming. So we could pretty much call it 1910 maybe. And if you do keep an eye on the technical previews that they release, I keep tabs on that. I do run a TV site. I don't always upgrade it, depending on if I have time or not. But I do like to look through the release notes and see what they've added, or if they've added any stuff that we've asked for. And this one pretty much caught my eye, which is this new variable that's coming up, which is setup complete pause. So I shot some emails off to see if this was something that could be leveraged, or how it actually worked, or what it actually did, and if we could use this currently, because we have seen a fair amount of issues where the TS is just not able to continue after the setup engine hands it back to the task sequence. And sure enough, actually, so I got this information back, is really what it's doing is it's just adding an extra pause using the timeout command to the setup complete CMD that gets run after the in-place upgrade gets returned from the Win10 setup. So we actually just enabled this this week because we're starting to do big numbers of like 15,000 a day, I think, or up to 15,000 a day. So we wanted to make sure that we kind of trim any erroneous errors that we're running into down, so that our task sequences complete, successfully. But definitely keep an eye out on things like this. If you do have ideas, or if you do see issues, definitely file bugs on them, because the CM team does listen and they do add stuff like this in, which is good. So
So we also have, this is very close to a native report that is based on status messages. And we have reports for all of our deployments, so we can go in and see how they are running. But that is one of the first things we go and check to for each day to kind of get an overall idea of how things are running. So for instance, in this deployment, we've got 283 that have failed. 112 are unexpected reboots. Thank you, end users. 169 are ones that they just didn't complete a step. For the most part, when we look into that, it's typically a pre-flight issue, like the machine wasn't plugged into power, um, or it wasn't online at the time it kicked off. So those are usually non-issues as well, and eventually they kind of work themselves out. Unexpected reboots, they're usually not a big deal. Those usually get figured out too. Not enough space in the cache. Typically that's because end user, or not an end user, but a tech went in and like reset the config manager client, so it's back to the default 5 gig cache size, which isn't large enough for all the payload. So once policy comes around and fixes that, then that would also then recache and continue on without an issue. So a lot of these will auto remediate over time, but we just want to come in here and just make sure that we're not seeing any weird trends with the upgrade. We also then have a lot of custom reports based upon our internal WAS keys. As Mike alluded to during OS uninstall, we capture all that information. Well, we capture everything to the registry, and then we collect all that information through hardware inventory. And we collect a lot of metrics and information so that we know exactly what's going on. So we can drill down to see like why machines are failing, different things. So like for this one, it's our pre-cache. Why are they failing the pre-cache? Well, in these, it failed to finish downloading the driver pack during the allotted time. We have a lot of very slow links, and a driver pack can be like 1 to 2 gig. So it might not actually finish downloading all that content during the available window for that task sequence to run. So the task sequence then will error out, but it then grabs the information telling us, oh, the last step that it failed on was a missing driver package, and tells us what percent downloaded of that driver package. So we get a lot of information through reports. Another report that is handy is our pre-flight. If it failed for a pre-flight, why did it fail? A lot of times, most of the time, we're finding that it's a laptop and it wasn't plugged into AC power when the upgrade started, which is a pretty easy thing. So how our pre-flight works is it will first check all those exact same rules as pre-assessment, make sure like all the software versions are at specific levels, and as long as those are, it will continue, and then it will do execution checks, or which we have labeled soft blockers versus a hard blocker. And those would be like the AC is not connected, or it's not on the network currently, or a low disk space. So then it would come back to, it would actually do a pop-up for the user if it's a soft blocker execution rule, which will then tell them, hey, can you plug in your laptop, and click continue. They plug it in, and then it would continue. If no one's there, it will eventually, after 15-minute wait time, retry automatically. And if it's not plugged in at that time, it will then error out and fail the task sequence. The reason that we kind of don't like how the pre-flight currently works is because it's technically a failure on the task sequence. It's not a failure for the upgrade, but it's a failure for the test sequence to run. And when you're trying to explain that to management, why the numbers might not look as good as they should, it's just bad reporting. So it's when we have these additional reports, we can kind of filter that for them to say, well, of the machines that actually ran the upgrade, this is the percent that actually upgraded versus these machines didn't even try to upgrade because the user didn't have it plugged in. We also have reports for if the machine rolled back. So it tried the task sequence, everything was good. It hit the setup engine started, it got partway through the setup and ran into an issue. I would say the majority of the issues are due to your security stack, especially if you're not using the Microsoft security stack, but the wonderful third parties. That has been our biggest issue of causing a rollback to happen. So we have control in place too that if a rollback were to happen, it triggers some scheduled tasks, which then will prepare the client, run setup diag, and write all the information to the keys. And then that gets scooped up through hardware inventory so that we can then report on which machines roll back and what stage did they roll back and what was some of the output from that. And then just as well, they want to know how many machines were successful from that collection, and so they can easily find that. They might want metrics on like, well, what's the average time it's taking for the in-place upgrade? So all that information's in here, and then they might want to see like, well, how many people opted in versus having required. So we capture that information as well, and how many attempts it took for the upgrade. Like our support people typically won't look at a machine until it's attempted the upgrade 3 times and failed. After that, they'll look at it. We've seen that if the machine upgrades and fails the first time, 90% of those will upgrade successfully the second time, and then of what's left, another 80% will successfully upgrade a third time. And to narrow down to exactly why it has been kind of difficult. It's probably files being locked by our antivirus, but they of course deny it until we can get proof, which we have from time to time. Users have seen pop-ups happen like these files were locked, or we can dig through the setup log and typically try to find which files caused the issue. So there's definitely a lot of time spent troubleshooting the issues, which is why we usually don't bother until after the third failed attempt for upgrade. And we have all the information through reports. And where does all that come from? It's hardware inventory. We have custom registry keys. If you've read my blog at all, you would see kind of the layout and all the keys that we use. Internally, we have quite a few more that I haven't updated yet on my blogs as we find more useful things that we want to capture. And so metrics are pulled from the setup engine, from the task sequence, and this year we're leveraging setup diag. Previous years I wasn't overly, it's a new product in general, and until this last couple of versions I wasn't really impressed with it, but now it when you run it, it spits out quite a bit of useful information. So we have that built right into our task sequence, and it actually runs whether it was a success or a failure, just to grab that extra information that setup diag creates. So if you haven't run setup diag before, this is the output. It creates, besides creating a log file, it also stamps it to the registry, and by default, it puts it into the setup registry key, which is also where all the setup information is going. So that is a key that you would want to know about if you're doing a lot of in-place upgrades, because it monitors your setup process. So then setup diag just takes advantage of it and dumps all this data in here as well. So this is an output from a failed upgrade during the safe OS phase. And it's nice because like the last phase at safe OS, you can go back to that diagram and they can look up, well, what's going on in that safe OS phase. And like it's all documented pretty well. And even in the setup diag, it puts a link to their website on where you can look up more of this information. It's also one of the other things I grabbed from here are which build number it was going to and the setup time. It actually captures how long the setup engine was running before it aired out, which is not something you can grab from the task sequence if there's an error. So I've been utilizing this to grab more useful metrics, which is a little bit closer than what we create on our own. Thanks for joining us. Let's see.
Do we have any questions? I know there was one that came in through the Q&A.
You want to repeat that, Mike? Maybe folks that didn't see the Q&A
Yeah.
and just kind of
So the question was, how are you handling scheduling / communications with such a dynamic list of devices that are ready to upgrade? And so that's not really Gary and myself. We have a scheduling / release management team that does all the device scheduling. We just do all the engineering work. So they have processes that they follow to communicate with various lines of businesses. So some of them do have communications. Other lines of business, they don't. The ones that do the controlled releases, they don't do any communications because it just runs at night, off hours, that kind of thing. So
We do highly leverage the built-in pop-ups, and Mike recently introduced the toast notifications, which is all CI based, so there's no additional content needed. If you want to cover that a little bit more, Mike.
yep. For those of you that know the task sequence properties pretty well, there's a little box that says enable notifications, and we have that disabled by default because last thing we want is it you get to see that annoying or the pop-up notification on a required deployment that you get for task sequences on like a digital signage machine. We don't want that happening. We don't want to be that guy that somebody takes a picture and tweets it out. So we actually control that via CIs as well, and we kind of worked with the scheduling team to determine which line of business should actually receive notifications, and we use another CI that basically controls the local policy for the enable notifications and lights those up. And then what Gary said is with the self-service option now, we wanted people to know that there's a Win 10 upgrade available. So we kind of took our own spin on some of the toast notifications that you see out there from guys like SMS Agent, and there's a couple others, and we put our own spin on it and actually deploy that via CI to our self-service or on-demand collection of where the deployment's available, so that they actually get that nice toast notification letting them know that something's available versus the typical software is available or whatever config manager pops open for a split second in the system tray. We figured nobody would actually even notice that because they get immune to that kind of thing. So that way we get a higher, hopefully a higher opt-in rate, because we do track that metric as well. And it's always kind of funny, even for the required ones that haven't hit their deadlines yet. We just got one the other day. We do get some end users that just get click happy apparently, and they just click, 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 click. And even though this end user hadn't crossed their required deployment time yet, they were pretty vocal about how they were interrupted with the upgrade running during their working hours and yada yada yada. And then we just pull up one of Gary's reports and say, oh, user opt-in equals true, which meant that they actually had to click through like 2 or 3 screens, and they kicked it off themselves instead of just leaving their machine on at night, letting it run then. So
Perfect. Any other questions for Mike and Gary? before Steve joins in. Because I know they have to drop, at least maybe Mike has to drop. So I want to make sure we cover questions. And you could unmute your mic if you want to just take a question. Nope. All right.
One just came in the Q&A here.
Okay.
Oh, it's a specific error code from upgrading from Win 7. Yeah, those would be the Panther logs is what you would focus on. But that error code doesn't look familiar to me. So that question is, what logs would you focus on if Win 7 upgrade rolls back during the phase 2 UBI phase? I guess it is. The error is 0x4000B. So that I'm not sure. But the documentation does have some really good, it'll break down the different hex codes and kind of give a point to like what potentially could be causing it. But also, like Gary said, take a look at setup diag and run that against, and it basically scrapes all those logs and then tries to determine what the actual root cause issue was. Okay, well, thanks everyone for the time. Appreciate it, and we'll let the tallest presenter ever, which he is tall. He's taller than you, Gary. Yeah. We'll turn it over to Mr. Rahi.
Thank you, Mike and Gary. I appreciate the time today. And looking forward to you guys in the future webcast or even in person in 2020. So I appreciate your support here.
Thanks for having us.
With that, we'll turn that over to Steve. Steve is a Microsoft, and this is the tallest presenter ever. Steve is a Microsoft Premier Field Engineer focusing on system management, and he's presenting today on the current branch in Microsoft Cloud on Administration Service. So we'll give that to Steve to go through his presentation. We do have 1 hour for this, and just as before, just write the questions in the Q&A. Well, we'll get to it when Steve has time to take a look at that, or we'll get to them all at the end of the session.
Of me going now is that I do have an hour, and I'm going to do it in an hour. I will. I promise. I'll try. But it may be a little bit over, and no one's after me, so that's cool. The other advantage of having me remotely is that you feel like you're not crowded in the room because of my presence, and then also you can turn me down, which you cannot do in person. So there we go. Yeah, I appreciate the chance to present today. I did want to talk about a topic that I've really just recently become familiar with, and it's really, really cool, and I like it a lot. And I'll give you some examples probably along the way of how you can use it, where it's being used. But it's this thing called the administration service. And so I'm curious. I'm not going to stop and ask for feedback here, though I may, as part of the session. I am curious, who has heard of the admin service, and even better yet, are there any that have used the admin service for doing some different things in Configuration Manager? So I'll keep going, but I'm curious for sure to hear that feedback, as we go along. I don't see the chat window right now, so if there's detail out there, someone wants to throw out the info, that's great. But let's get started. And so this is kind of where we're going. And by the way, I will tell you, if you hear the sound of a dog in the background, I apologize. I have I have my little 16-year-old Bichon Frise here, and she just had to have eye surgery yesterday, and she's not enjoying life at the moment. So I get it, right? But anyway, plus she just wants to learn about the admin service. That's what it is. So here's our agenda. We're going to talk about what the admin service is, why we would care about it. We'll go through some of the basics, requirements, components, how it works kind of deal, all with the goal of getting to the configuration section, talking about how it works, showing you how it works, and so on, right? Cool. So what is this thing called the administration service? Our documentation is certainly enough to explain what this is. It's not enough to really tell you the deep details of what it is, right? So what this is effectively a web service. Customers through the years have had to build their own web services to do things like providing access to config manager data when they run a task sequence or a script or whatever else, right? This is a web service that we provide to you, which means you don't have to build it yourself anymore, right? This is built in. It's interesting, though. We call it a web service, and it is a web service, but it is not. It is not something that you will ever see in IIS, right? Never see in IIS at all. But it's hosted as a web service. So I kind of think of this as similar to SQL, right? So years ago, whenever config was out there, we would be using the SQL reporting service. SQL reporting service was running in IIS, and so on. Now that's not true. IIS instance for SQL reporting service is self-hosted. So that's kind of true here. Also, the administration service is built based on the structure of the REST API framework. Right? Now, if you have never played with Microsoft Graph and don't understand what I mean by a REST API, let me summarize it this way. An API is something that we think of in code that we might, as we're writing script or writing C# or something like that, pardon me, call this API to take care of a task. A very simple example would be if you want to write a string of text to your screen, you are going to call a predefined API and pass in that string of text. You don't have to write the code that actually translates that onto your screen. That's what an API is. And that kind of might scare people because APIs historically they're very programming centric, right? And certainly you can use the REST API in programming. I want to show you some examples of that. But the REST API is a URL. It's like calling a web page. That's the web service thing, right? It is calling a web page. And you can get a lot of very, very rich data out of the REST API. This thing runs as a service in Config Manager. And again, you'll see that in a minute. Read only, you notice I have an asterisk there. So what we do document the administration service is that we support it for read-only operations right now. But that said, I'm going to show you an example in this session where we ourselves use the administration service beyond just read-only. Right? There's also a gentleman named Adam Gross. He is an MVP, and he has a series of blogs on the administration service. Now, what he does is he does a lot of work with the technical previews and started way early on. And some of the things he does are really, that they're not really workable in the form that he describes today. And I should say this presentation is based on Config Manager 1906, but he has some good precursor information. One of the questions he asks, and you might ask as you see some of what I'm going to show you, is the administration service a replacement for WMI, right? And the answer is a little bit complicated. He actually calls it complicated in his blog post. I like the way he says that. You're going to see what would look like the boilerplates of replacing WMI, right? And certainly the goal would be to translate a lot of the WMI work that we do into this administration service. One of the comments that was made by David James that Adam references in his blog is that there are about 300 man years or person years of development time that has gone into the current version of Config Manager to make it work with all the WMI and different things. So it'll be if we get it pulled out and where we're not totally relying on WMI anymore, it'll be a long time coming. But I think you're going to see some efforts toward that, some first level efforts toward that as we go along. Now, okay, I was going to pause there for a minute, but I'll go on for a sec. So why do we care, pardon me, about the administration service? Well, there's lots of places where we might need to access Config Manager data or interact with Config Manager data. I can think of a couple that come to mind, right? And you'll see a couple of very simple examples of using this in the session. But I'll give you a couple of scenarios. There's a company that I've worked with that is planning to, or in the process of building, pardon me, a solution where they can host Config Manager in Azure for customers that want management by Config Manager, but they don't want to run Config Manager themselves. They would rather, have the standardized approach, the standardized environment, and so they are building it currently. We've been talking a lot about how they might be able to interact with what they anticipate to be hundreds of Config Manager environments and do a lot of automation, do a lot of data reading and health checking and all sorts of different things. And the administration service is a beautiful fit for them, a perfect fit for being able to do that, right? There's other examples where you might want to access data. One that I helped a customer think through, there's a lot of organizations that, and we have a solution right now to help with this too, but there's a lot of organizations historically that will copy their Config Manager database to another SQL server because their different teams want to access the Config Manager data. Well, okay, I mean, we have the data warehouse now to be able to support something like that. But also, if there's a need to just get into the data through automation and pull different values and things that way, the administration service could be an interesting fit for that. The administration service could easily allow you to access data, import it in the Config Manager infrastructure while you're doing deployments, such as task sequences, application approvals, and so on, right? Secure connections. This is a really, really important one. Being able to make sure that you access this data, but you do so securely. The administration service is fully dependent on an SSL connection, port 443. We do secure our communications with certificates, either the enhanced HTTP cert or a PKI generated certificate. Again, you'll see that in just a minute, and you'll see a couple of scenarios as I go through. So let me pause there. I was going to pause a second ago. I've got a lot to go, right? But this is something that a lot of people have never really heard of, right? So how we do it? Let me pause. If you have anything that you want to get clarity on, or if I haven't explained something clearly, let me stop and do that now. So please throw it in the chat window if you have a question, because it's just going to make some assumptions from here that what I've said so far is understandable. So please throw it in. And Jay, if there's something that comes into the chat window for some reason I'm not seeing it here, just break in and tell me and we can talk about it, okay?
Will do.
All right, moving on. So the administration service requirements, again, this is based on 1906. And previous from 1906, this is all mostly true too. We required .NET 4.5. Prior to 1906 is .NET 4.5.2, right? Config Manager current branch at least 1810 forward. We do require SSL communication. There's a blog from Adam that talks about setting this up and reverting it back to non-SSL requirement. We don't support that at all. We've stripped out that ability totally. We want SSL. And then there's a note here about a user account, right? So that is true. It is a requirement to have a user account, but that's really more to have a user account. But that requirement is really more around if we want to have this running through the Cloud Management Gateway, which I'll talk about more in a minute, right? We do fully support the admin service through the Cloud Management Gateway. In order to do that, I'll just say this now, the user account that's running the request for the admin service needs to be one that can authenticate with Azure AD. That's the requirement there. Okay, so the components, and a little bit, starting to try to pull the covers back a little bit as we go into this. There are a few components required for the admin service to work. The admin service rides on top of your SMS provider. So if you have one or five SMS providers, it doesn't matter. When you deploy a new SMS provider, the administration service is installed right alongside that SMS provider, and it is enabled by default. So anyone who has 1902 of Config Manager forward does have the administration service running now. You may not be using it, but it is running. The SMS provider and the administration service actually works through what some folks will refer to as a provider, some folks will refer to as routes. Routes is the right way, which I'll talk about in a minute. So there we go. Obviously, you have to have the administration service if we're talking about the administration service, and that is a component. I'll show you what it looks like. It's out there running, again, by default. You need to have something that is calling the administration service. So there's a lot of examples of that. The ones that I'll show you a couple. I'll show you three, actually. But anything from a browser to PowerShell script to Power BI to the Config Manager console to there's a software piece called Postman. There's VB scripts that you could probably tailor it and use. There's a lot of ways that you could use the admin service, that you could call the admin service, right? You'll see, I said three, you'll see four of them as we go through. We have the Cloud Management Gateway, so I'll put an asterisk there. This is not a strictly required piece. If you are going to be managing internet-based clients, then you will have the Cloud Management Gateway, most likely, and we will then be able to work with the Cloud Management Gateway. There's some nuances to that if we have time I'll get into, but know that that's out there. Finally, we have what are called routes, right? Routes. And what a route is effectively a way that we will kind of organize and present data that you can access through the admin service. Right now we have WMI route, and what that does is it sits on top of WMI and is kind of a conduit by which you could call WMI namespaces. So you might ask, okay, well that's great, Steve. I can call WMI myself. Why would I ever need to call WMI through the administration service? Well, okay, great. You can call WMI yourself right now, but working with it is a little bit more interesting with some of the ways that we call WMI the admin service. Admin service is pretty easy to understand. The other thing is you can call WMI if you're on-prem. You cannot call WMI if you are on a client remote from Config Manager, but through the admin service, you could. Right? Then there's what's called a V1 route. And that is a route that specifically supports operations that are done by the admin or by the admin console using the admin service. I'll show you that. Right? So I'll put this thing in the middle of that diagram called $metadata. So and I'll show this to you. So if you want to look within a route and see what kind of data is presented that you can then manipulate and work with within that, then all you have to do is throw the $metadata tag at the end. Right? So if I want to see all the WMI namespaces, I could just put WMI/$metadata, and I would get it. Same thing with V1, right? And you'll see that in just a second. So how does this thing work? Two scenarios. One is on-prem, one is the Cloud Management Gateway. And so what we have simply is we have someone or something that is going to call the admin service. So an administrator might access the administration service to retrieve data. Could be a browser, could be a script, could be the config man console, could be whatever, right? And now in this case, it's probably going to be an administrator accessing the admin service to pull data that might normally be manipulated in the Configuration Manager console, right? And so we'll have that. Then we might have another starting point where a deployment is going to require access to the administration service. Again, that might be a task sequence, approval notification, something else, right? And what happens here, a deployment is typically going to access maybe something like a task sequence. Might want to access something that's a variable condition or something like that that's within Config Manager, and then do something differently based on that, right? Either way, whenever that happens, the second step is the admin service, which is known as the SMS_REST_provider, will receive the request, hand it over to the provider. So that might be the provider machine. Provider is going to interact with SQL. Request is processed, and then finally the response is sent back to whoever called for the data. Okay? Now, another option would be with the Cloud Management Gateway. So the Cloud Management Gateway here, the deployment will, in this scenario, maybe go back through the Cloud Management Gateway, access the admin service, do the same kind of call, and then backwards. Now, let me illustrate this. I didn't realize I kept this note in here. That's funny. The browser does work with the CMG. I did take that out. That was for something when I was working with the CMG, so you can ignore that. But let me give you an example of what I mean. So I referred to this company standing up a service where they will have hundreds of Config Manager site servers that are providing service uniquely to customers, right? Managed Config Manager site servers unique to the customer. And they wanted automation to be able to go check in on all of these servers remotely just to make sure they're healthy and different things. Well, the other wrinkle to this is that the app that they're building that will kind of manage the whole flow of things, that is built in Amazon Web Services, not Azure, right? The virtual machines that host Config Manager are in Azure, and so effectively we have a hybrid cloud environment. So they wanted to be able to find a way to get into all of these Config Manager environments and do the things they needed to do. The answer was that for every Config Manager they had, they would stand up a Cloud Management Gateway, and they could call in from Amazon Web Services through the Cloud Management Gateway to the particular instances of Config Manager, get the data they needed, pull it all into their app and Amazon Web Services, and do what they needed, right? So it was a very unique, interesting implementation of the administration service, but also kind of underscores the power of the web service and how it can be used in a number of different scenarios. Now to my favorite part of any presentation, and that is getting to the demo. Now, I will show you, so the first thing is, and I'm not going to show this to you yet, I'll show it to you in a little bit, kind of. We need a certificate. In order to work with the administration service, we need a certificate. There are two options. One is, and the recommended one is, using an enhanced HTTP cert. Actually, I'll show it to you. We'll show it to you a couple of times. That way you can have the repetition there. To use an enhanced HTTP cert. Right? So the enhanced HTTP cert is not set there. It's set under here. Under sites, go to properties of the site, and then go to communication security. And here's where you would set HTTPS or both. But then this option, use configuration manager generated certificate for HTTP site systems, that is enabling what's called enhanced HTTP. Enhanced HTTP is very easy to work with, but it does have some things that are different about it that you would need to handle in an environment such as the administration service, which you'll see. I'll show you all that. The other option is to use a third-party PKI generated certificate. Now, you could do one on-prem, but third-party probably is just as easy. That is very workable, absolutely workable, no problem if you want to go that way. And there are advantages to that if you want to go that way. So I'll show you that in a minute. Okay? So you need a cert. The other thing is that you need to decide how you want to use this. So if you are, like I said, the administration service is enabled by default. There's nothing you need to do to turn it on in 1902 forward. You need the cert, so you do need to configure that. Again, I'll dig into the cert a little bit more in a second. Once beyond those two, there's two additional options. One of them is kind of an on-prem only kind of thing. It's basically whether you want to allow the config manager console itself to use the administration service. So the way I turn that on is on the site, I'll go to hierarchy settings, and then at the bottom, enable the configuration manager console to use the administration service. That is not on by default. And I will also tell you, when you turn that on, you'll see this in a minute. When you turn that on, that does not mean that the entire config manager console is going to use the administration service, only a portion right now. Right? And then the other decision you need to make is whether you want to configure this so that the administration service can be used through the cloud management gateway. Sorry, here we go. Nope, that's not even right. There we go. So that will be a decision that you make on the SMS provider. So if you go into properties on the provider, there's a checkbox there. Allow config manager cloud management gateway traffic through the administration service, right? So all up to you how you want to do that. But that's it for configuring it, right? Now, don't get the get the mindset this is a very simple service, because it's not, right? It's pretty simple to use, really simple to implement. But now let's actually go see this thing in action. So a few demos here. So the first thing I want to illustrate for you is this idea of routes. So very simply put, I'm going to go in and I'm going to open my browser and I'm going to access the web service. And you're going to see a little bit of a nuance here, but that's okay. Okay, so here's that, and then admin service, and this is case sensitive, /WMI is one of my providers. Now, that's an okay query to run, but you see, it immediately says, no, there's a problem with the cert here, and so you cannot continue. I have no option here to continue at all. What I can do, and this is an interesting little option, is I can change this FQDN to localhost, and notice that my message changes, right? Now it says continue to the website, right? So here's the deal. Why am I getting this message? I'm getting this message because right now the site is configured to use an enhanced HTTP cert, which is great. Except that is a self-signed certificate that does not have any way to build a certificate trust chain back to the root certificate. And so this is a cert that we can use to validate security, but it's not one that we can validate back to a trusted source that generated the cert. And that's why I get this error message. Now, I can go to this just fine. I'm just going to continue to the website. And oops, what did it do? Localhost, oh, that's why. Let's do that. I'm going to continue to the website, and it should. Why is it not working for me? Okay, let me just do this from the beginning. Localhost, admin service, WMI. All right, don't mess with me. Come on, lab. All right. Let me add another tag and see if that's going to get me where I need to be. Oh, good. So I didn't put the trailing backslash. That's interesting. But notice what happened. It has a JSON file that opens up. So I told you if you just simply access the route, you will be able to see every single thing that's accessible in that route. And you notice that I have word wrap not turned on here. And so it's not a huge file, but if I turn word wrap on, notice that it's going to reformat, and there's a bunch here. There's a ton of data that comes in here. Right? There's tons and tons and tons, and that's not really readable. Yeah, once you know what's in there and you know what you're accessing, that's great. But that's not really, easily readable. So what I can do is I can just add a tag, metadata, and it's going to go through there, and it's going to take that same data and format it for me nicely in the browser, right? So I can go through and see all of the different things. Now, this is the WMI route. These are WMI classes that I can access through the administration service, all the different detail that I can get from it, and so forth. So that's really easy to at least get an inventory of the kind of detail that you can grab using the administration service. So let me go change that to V1, right? Oh, come on. Browsers, open another browser here. Let me just open another one. Oh, wait, go away. There we go. All right, cool. So, localhost, admin service, type correctly, it will work better. V1, and same thing, I'm going to do metadata. And I have to do an HTTPS. So let's go open that. And so this V1 route is what the admin console will use as it's working against the administration service. So you see an abbreviated list of things here because there's not a ton that we yet support with the admin service with the console. But I will call your attention to a couple of things. So I mentioned before that we support read-only, right? But with read-only, you can do a lot of interesting things. We can handle approval requests. Like if you have an app that you're sending out that you're trying to do an approval of it, require approval, we can work with with the deny if we want to. We can run CM pivot. We can do a whole lot, right, with the admin service, no problem, right? So that's just the most basic usage of the admin service, right? Okay. So let's roll on here. We'll quickly be back to the lab. So scenario one, calling the admin service. So you've seen me call the admin service, right? I'm going to do it again in the browser. So we're going to work through a couple of demos here, a couple of ways that we can call the admin service. So the first, notice, the URL, again, I'm using localhost so I can actually bypass the certificate problem. So let me just show you a couple of things. I can sit here and do examples all day long and probably not get done with anything because there's just so much data that we might want to access. Localhost, admin service. You've seen me call WMI, right? So I'm not going to do that again. But now that you've seen me call the base WMI, I'm going to reference a namespace within. So there I'm just tagging it SMS collection. Okay, so this is a name of a class that is in WMI. And this has to be the exact name of the class, including the exact case of the class. And if I hit that, what it's going to do is tell me the same thing. I'm going to continue to the website, and it's going to give me the option to open a JSON. I'm going to open that up, and here I get to see things that are available to me as far as the collection. Now, I've not done this yet. I've not tried to do this yet. I haven't thought about doing this yet, but let's just see if this works. Nope, I didn't think so. Okay, so I tried to add the metadata tag to the end of that. It didn't pull anything back, so I didn't think so. But you can get that data. It doesn't matter how it appears in the notepad representation here because that's not how you're going to be using it probably, right? You're going to be using it with some sort of code, most likely, and then you can just read to the data that you want and so on, right? And again, calling out the certificate issue that I was having that I had to bypass and move on, okay? So that's using a browser. I've showed you a few examples of that. Now let's go use a PowerShell script. Let's access this with a PowerShell. So I've got a few examples here that I'll just use a simple one. ISE, run that as admin. Okay, here we go. Don't care, go away. No, go away, Sorry, I didn't do anything with those. Go away. No. Okay, so let me open a script. Open, and there's a couple of different scripts right here. So here's a basic script, and I'm going to use this to call the admin service. Again, you can call whatever in the admin service you want to call. You can deal with that data as you get it back. I don't care about that. I'm just showing you how to just do a basic call. So what I'm doing is I need credentials in order to access the admin service. So I'm going to ask for those when this runs. Here's my site server name. Here's the URL. I'm actually going to look for SMS_collection. Here's the constructed URL right here, right? And then I'm going to use the PowerShell commandlet invoke REST method to run the URL, right? And then I'm just going to output the results. So let's go run this and see what happens. So I'm going to run it. And it fails. Right? It fails. Why does it fail? Anyone know? Want to guess? Here's the full error message. Who's guessing? Someone come off mute and guess. If you're putting it in the chat window, I can't see it right now. So ordinarily here, I would wait for a response. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on. But I would just ask you to look at this error message and think through why this is failing. The reason this is failing is because we don't have a certificate in place where we can validate the trust relationship back to a certificate authority. We are using the enhanced HTTP cert, which works beautifully, but because of that, because of our lack of ability to actually validate the trust relationship, we have to work around the cert issue. And so let me open up script number 2, where I actually work around the cert issue. So here is with a cert bypass. Now, this is for me to show you. I would definitely not recommend that you do this in a production environment the way that I have it. Right? I just found this little example from this blog right here. Right? So whatever. But what this is doing is it's essentially saying, look, this whole section is essentially saying, look, it really doesn't matter what the cert challenge and validation says. Always say that you're going to trust all cert policy. Doesn't matter. Just bypass it, right? In production, if I were going to do this, I would know what my thumbprint is for my enhanced HTTP cert. And instead of validating everything, I would say, if it's actually trying to access this particular cert, then it's okay. Right? But you don't want to validate everything in production because there could be something that a hacker's trying to do, perhaps. But in this case, it's a good way to give as an example. The rest of the script is exactly the same. No difference. So this time I'm going to run it. And what did it do? Oh, I see what I did. I was sorry. I've been doing a little bit of work for another thing real quick, and I changed the URL. So let me change it back, and I will just comment this one. I forgot to change it back. That's okay. Now let's run it again. There. Much better, right? So we actually get the list of collections that I wanted to get using SMS_collection, calling into my administration service locally. I'm doing all this on-prem right now. And I bet I was able to do that even with an enhanced HTTP cert because I bypassed the cert problem. Okay? Let's go try another example of how we connect in and call this data. We're going to use Power BI Desktop. So let's launch that, and I'm going to try to call in and use Power BI to build some nice reports based on config manager data. All right, cool. So I'm going to say get data. And so in here, I'm going to select an OData connection because the administration service uses the OData authentication and so on. And so what I'm going to put in here is just a URL. I'm going to use the version 1 namespace now. So https colon, I'll use localhost, admin service v1. So what this should do is pull back a list of all the namespaces or the routes information under this, right? What it's going to do instead, though, is it's going to say, yeah, no, it's not going to work. It's going to give me this so I can try to go through it and such. I'm going to go to Windows and just say use my current credentials. I'm going to try that again. And it's going to come back and say, no, you can't do it. Why? The underlying connection was closed, no trust relationship. The cert problem again, because I'm using enhanced HTTP. Well, now in this case, I've not found a way around it here. There may be one, right? But in this case, if you're going to do something like this, you really do need a trusted cert. Okay, so I've actually produced a trusted cert from my own internal certificate authority. It's a web cert. I'm not going to go through the steps to show you exactly how to do that. It's really not hard. We document it really, really well. But what I will show you is setting this up. So if I go down to Windows Administration Tools and then go down to IIS, so I'll show you a couple of things here. And under Sites, and here, default website, edit bindings. So here's my port 443. Again, the website is not in IIS. You're not going to see the administration website at all under default website, but we will pick up the cert from IIS. So I can edit this. So what this is right now, this is the SMS role SSL cert. That is enhanced HTTP. This is the cert that I created for the admin service. The way I know that is I view it, go to details, and scroll down a little bit and see the, there it is, template. This is one I built, web cert for admin service. So that's what it's based on. So I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to close this. Now, the admin service won't use that cert yet. The way that I get the admin service to use the cert is to restart it. Right? Now, this is a thread of the executive, so I'm going to have to go into registry. This is the way I'm going to do it anyway. And here is the REST provider. This is just one of the registry keys where you can restart a thread. It's under Components, SMS Executive Threads, SMS REST Provider. So my requested operation here, I'm going to say stop. Great. And refresh. It's stopping, and it stopped. Requested operation, start. Okay. It's starting and running. Right. So we are good here. So I'll go ahead and close or minimize registry editor. And the way that I know that we have started with the correct cert this time is I can go into the admin service log, and I can look at it, and it will say, go ahead and, where is the cert thing? I'm probably missing it, but let's see. Search up. You can see it. Why didn't I? Oh, sorry. That's because I'm looking at the wrong log. Let me look at the REST provider log. That's a better log to see. Okay, so here we're selecting the cert. It is verifying the cert. Cert is not issued by Config Manage, but that means it is a standard PKI cert. So we should be good to go. Right? Now I'm going to go through and get data with this. Hit more. Go back and do the OData connection. There. Great. And do the same thing. V1. And see what we get now. Oh, did I do that wrong? Let's me start the Power BI again. Let me start this again. Okay, try it one more time. Data, go. Try the FQDN / admin service / v1. That is what I want, right? I think so. Okay, and so now we do have data. So with Power BI, we can now access the data that we were hoping to with the admin service, and no problem. And that's as far as I'm going to take it here, but you get the idea that we can absolutely do that. No problem at all. So I'm just going to leave that. Actually, I'm going to change that cert back because I will forget if I don't, and I expect it to not be there. Some other things I'm doing, so standby. Edit bindings here. Change that back to the SSL cert. Great. Okay. Yes. Okay. And close. Cool. So that's that way. Now, so that's just a couple of examples to show you how to call the admin service. Okay. Now what I want to do is take you through a couple of practical examples using this in Config Manager. Oh, and the other thing I need to do, I need to restart the admin service so it's using my third-party cert. So bear with me while I do that. Otherwise, what I'm doing next may or may not work. Stop. And F5. And start. And OK. F5. Okay, good, good, good. So it's done. All right, so now, in order to show you this, pardon me, let me pull this out for a minute. So I'm going to do a task sequence. And so I've got a script here that is a very simple script. This is the same script, just bypassing the cert issue, right? And then the same script where I'm calling in, I'm passing my credentials in the script, because you noticed before the script prompted me for credentials. I don't want it to prompt me for credentials. The credentials need to be embedded in the script. And so that's what I'm doing here. Guys, give me 1 second. Sorry, my dog was rubbing her area that she had surgery on in a way that she shouldn't. So anyway, so what I'm doing here is I'm just going to call the SM _boundary class in a task sequence. Okay. Now, so the script isn't really all that exciting, right? But the point is that you can do it within a task sequence. So let me show you how that works. Pull this in. And in Config Manager now, I have my demo task sequence under Software Library here, and my task sequence should be deployed. This is it. 2 hugely exciting steps, right? One to set a variable that I was messing with, and another one to run the PowerShell script. Here's that script I was showing you snippets of, except it does have my plain text password in it, so I won't show it to you on the screen. But that's it, and I've got it deployed to just a collection with a test machine. This is a non-imaging task sequence. You could do the exact same thing with an imaging task sequence, no problem at all. It's just knowing how to grab it, right? So let me pull in another machine where I have this deployed here, here, and open up Software Center. Right, so very exciting. I have a task sequence that should be here and deployed, and I should be able to run it no problem. Here we go. Here we go. I'm going to reinstall it. And so that's going to run like a task sequence will, pop up, and it's going to just do its thing quickly, and then it's going to be done. Right? Finished, and we're good. Come on, run. There we go. So it's done. And so if I go look at my SMSTS log, then let me just make sure I'm grabbing it from the right location here. SMSTS log. Again, nothing in here is going to be really exciting except for the fact that we can prove that we ran the particular task sequence. So here's me running the PowerShell script. You can tell that the PowerShell script ran. The thing that you will see that actually is indicative of the PowerShell is that we ran this particular call to the admin service and got data. I could then work on the data if I wanted to inside the task sequence or the script or whatever, but at least you see it's calling it. It's not a problem at all. You know, works just fine. So let me pull this out of the picture for a moment and grab this other one out of the picture for a moment. And another one that I'll show you, again, really exciting, really simple, you know, but again, shows how this works, is running a script. So I can just have a script configured in Config Manager and run it against a client. No problem. So let's just go under scripts here. I have a very simple script right here, right? Just pull it up real quick. There it is. And so it's going to use the admin service. So what I'm going to do is just go to this collection or list of devices. And I'm going to go to this one I just ran the task sequence on. And I'm going to run the script. And so here's the script. And I'm going to go click next and click next. And it's going to start running. It's going to go run. Here's the machine it's running against. And so let me go look at scripts here. And probably it's already done. But you go to the bottom and it's running. Here's the command line. It's executing. Here's the process. It just finished running the script. Exit code 0. We're good, right? So through the scripts, through task sequences, through deployments, through other ways. I'll show you a deployment here. And actually, while I'm thinking about it, let me show this to you. One of the other things, I'm pulling this up on another screen. One of the other things that we talk about possibly using the admin service for is approving app deployments. Let me log in real quick. Oh, come on. Give me a second. Here, I think. Yeah. So this is just an email I sent to myself, an admin approval, right, that I was doing for Rich Copy, and here's my approve or deny. Well, look at those URLs. Those are admin service URLs, right? And so that, you know, works with application approval notification, you know, as well. And so, you know, kind of FYI. As another way that we could do this. Let me go ahead and get this out of the picture and close that. Get this out of the picture for a moment. And then one more scenario that I'll show you is using the Configuration Manager console to be able to use the admin service. So let's pull that back in. Now, I have not shown you the admin service log yet, except by accident. The admin service log is where you see all of the calls to the admin service happening. So that script I showed you a minute ago was making a call to SMS_boundary. You can see that in the admin service log being processed right here, right? So that was calling in from the script running in the task sequence. So I can watch everything that's going on with my admin service right here. Well, I'm going to pull this to the side for a minute. Pull this to the side for a minute. I have the admin console enabled to work with the admin service. Right now, what that means is the nodes under here can work with the admin service. That's what that means, right? None of the other nodes. And so when I go in and I click on administrative user, for example, that populates like normal. But what happens is that call is running through the admin service, and it just did it. It did the call. It showed you the results. Here's everything coming back. Here's what it accessed, and so on, right? So any node under security, if you turn it on, can access the admin service. But notice that this request was a GET. It was a GET request. because this, as I said, supports read-only right now. But let's just do an example. Let's go to security roles, right? Sorry, security scopes. Let's just say that I want to get rid of this one. I'm going to delete that security scope, right? So it does it, and notice in the log that it handles that request no problem, but this time, this is a delete request. It is not a get request, it is a delete request. So we are, even though we say that we only support, and we do only support read-only, when our own admin console uses it, we're doing beyond read-only, right? And so it is, the point of that is, you're gonna, if you go to the Adam Gross blogs, you will see a lot of examples of how to do some really cool things that are beyond read requests that you can do. There's a tremendous amount of power here for automation and different things, but just be careful because that area beyond read request is still definitely a use at your own risk kind of thing. Your mileage may vary kind of thing. All right. Okay, so let's get that out of the picture. Starting to get to the end here. In terms of other examples, here's just, instead of just sitting here making you watch me call the admin service over and over and over and over again, here's just another example, kind of a query that builds on itself. So here I'm pulling out SMSR system, which is the all systems collection, right? Then I might want to hone in on one particular system. Here's the resource ID for that system. And so it just pulls back one system. Or maybe I want to pull back information about the operating system on that system. Well, then I just tag on to that and say I want the operating system. So again, a lot of flexibility in this. You can get as deep in you want to. You can call different things. You can filter the results all on the command line. Right? The other part is that you can, I've got some scenarios. I'm working on this session for MMS, and I'll present it there. There will be some Cloud Management Gateway things I will do. The thing I'll tell you about the Cloud Management Gateway is to access it, to access the admin service through the Cloud Management Gateway, you have to access what's called the Cloud Management Gateway endpoint. This is the Cloud Management Gateway endpoint. You can find out what yours is by running this query, and then you would use this URL to access the admin service, and it would go through the Cloud Management Gateway. Okay. All right. So starting to wrap up some logs, troubleshooting tips and tricks. There's some really good detail. I showed you the SMS REST provider log, right? So that log is where you see the status of the actual service itself. That's the one I restarted when I changed the cert and things. The admin service log showed you that as well. This is where we log commands against the administration service. There is one called the REST provider setup log that will record whether we successfully set up the REST provider. So if you're having trouble, you can't get yours to work, well, then take a look and see if maybe there's a problem with setup. Another couple of things, let me just pull this up real quick. Event viewer. So we can see some detail about what's happening with the admin service in the application. Come on and open. Seriously. This way. That's just weird. So you can go and see under the admin or application log, if you go and filter the current log, and then you look for a source. Now it's probably trying to catch up with me. Anyway, so you try to look at the source, and you do CM REST provider. CM, is that what it is? Yeah, CM REST provider. Oh, why am I not seeing it? guess I don't know why I don't see it. I must have cleared the log. But there will be a number of events in here with CM REST provider service as the source. You can hone in, see what's going on, if there's any errors and things like that. Now, I spent some time in the, oh, that's why. That's why, because I'm on my domain controller. Let me get back on the right machine. There, that would be a better experience. But anyway, you could absolutely see what's in the event log that way. Now, I showed you this registry key, and that's where I stop and start the service and do different things. There are several registry keys around here that are interesting for the administration service. So let's see, that's under components. Make sure I'm looking at the right one. Yeah, under components, we have this one down to the executive. We also have a key for the REST provider right there. That will tell you some interesting setup detail and just confirmation that it's looking at the right site and so on. We also have under SMS Site Component Manager, Site Component Manager. We have the component servers. This is where your provider is. So you can see components, you can see REST provider, and this at least tells you that it's on the right server and what the configurations are. So there's mine on my provider system in detail. There's also, if you want to be able to debug this thing and look at it a little bit closer, there's some settings you can make under tracing. So tracing SMS REST provider, it's right here. And what you see is that you have debug logging you can do. You can change the log level, max settings, and so on. I'm just using default logging, and it tells you a lot. So good deal. Now, the actual service itself is run by, in fact, let me just show you in Task Manager. You'll see this running. There's something called the SMS provider graph, or SCCM provider graph. There it is. So you know it's running, right? This is it running and listening and so on. You can get a little bit of additional information if you go into, or see it better if you go into C:\program files / here, and then go into x64. Then you have CM REST provider. There are two files here. There's the graph service itself, the exe, and then here's a config file. So there are different configurations that you might want to look at in here. You know, certainly only change things if you're talking with someone that knows what they're doing, or that you know what you're doing. But there's the different configs for it. And then finally, back in the console, we can see the status of the REST provider. If we go under system status, and then site stat component status. Yeah, component status. We'll have the SMS REST provider REST there, and you can see any status messages related to it. It's in a happy state right now, so we're good. All that said, that kind of gets us to the end of what I wanted to show you. I could spend a lot more time here, but just look at your clock and note, I am finishing with only 1 minute to spare. So wanted to share this with you. I find the admin service to be very interesting, very compelling, rich with possibilities. And that said, I would love to stop and hear from y'all. I didn't see the results of the survey. Did anyone know about the REST provider before this, Jay? Or the
most people did not.
Okay. All right. So I'd love to hear your feedback. Was this interesting? Do you see possibilities with this? Questions that you have, and I will hush and let y'all talk.
Yeah, feel free to add to the Q&A section, as well as unmute your mic to ask the question. We'll stay on for a few more minutes to make sure everybody gets a chance.
Hey Steve, can this be used? So you said during a task sequence, but in WinPE, and do you still need to provide credentials?
You do need to provide credentials, but yes, it could.
You just have to import your certificate into WinPE.
No, because all you're doing is making, you're running PowerShell through WinPE, and you're just calling out to the admin service. And so the if you're well, so I see your point. If you're going to use the enhanced cert, you would have to work around the cert. But if you're using a PKI cert and it's fully trusted, right? I did not install any certs on my Windows 10 test or my test machine. My test machine was able to work because the cert chain could be validated by the admin service, right? And so you should be able to do that no problem if you have a PKI cert. You should also be able to do it no problem with an enhanced HTTP cert as long as you handle that in your script.
Your script samples are going to be not available for download somewhere or out on your Git.
I don't know. They could be. Mine are very. So what I would do is point you to the Adam Gross blog. He has a lot more. Um, you can have mine if you want them. They're not exciting. Uh, there are a lot of good script examples on Adam Gross's blog uh, called A Square Dozen. So
Will there ever be an option someday for not having to use credentials for like a task sequence so you don't have to embed credentials in your thing to pull back
well,
information?
that's a good point. So I would not embed my credentials. I would not embed credentials in a script that I'm using through a task sequence. What I would do instead is set variables that contain the username and password, and then add those variables in the script and pass it that way. That way, that stays encrypted through the process. You know, the variables are protected, and you can still provide the credentials you want.
What is the minimum rights in config manager for that account?
There is no account that you need. The account comes into play when you're running through the Cloud Management Gateway. It would need to be an Azure AD account that we could validate with through the Cloud Management Gateway. On-prem, you don't need one. Sorry, I understand your question. Sorry, I heard the question different than what you asked. You need to be at least able to read that data, right? You need to be able to get. So a standard user is not going to probably have rights. It won't have rights to the config manager namespace in WMI to read the data. So you need an account that has the rights to read the data. What I thought you were asking, what I heard you say, which you didn't, is my mind translated that to the Cloud Management Gateway. And so you do need an account in the Cloud Management Gateway scenario. In that case, it needs to be an account that can validate against Azure AD itself.
All right, any more questions for Steve?
Awesome. Well, folks, I appreciate you letting me hang out with you. And Jay, if you hear anything else or folks have questions or need anything, just let me know.
Yep, and I will upload this recording to YouTube and post it on Twitter and tag all the presenters today. So if you do have questions, you could always reply to the tweet and ask them directly there as well. Thank you for your time. Gary, I see you're still on, as well as Steve and Mike for the great sessions today. Look forward to a email in the next few weeks for the next one, probably sometime in December, early January. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of the afternoon.